I am so excited to announce that my very own podcasting platform, the one I use every time I record, Zencaster, has become a new sponsor of the show. Listen later on for a discount link and check the show notes and stay tuned for why I love using Zencaster for the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, January 24th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we get into this week's episode, it's a smelly good one. I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and a big part of that is the support of listeners just like you. If you want to pledge your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy and learn all about it. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, Dudas Infinitus, Frederick Fast Markison, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, Ulrika Hagman. Thank you guys all so much. You are rock stars. And this thank you isn't just coming from me. It's coming from all the people who are listening right now. Okay, let's talk about this week's episode. So I had the opportunity to chat with Jude Stewart. And Jude is a journalist who has been featured in a bunch of different amazing publications, everything from Slate to The Atlantic to Fast Company. She even recently had a piece in the Wall Street Journal. She often writes about design and culture, sometimes about food, sometimes about business, and she's also written two books previously. They are Roy G. Biv and Paternalia. But her new book is it's very scientific. It's really exciting. It's actually called Revelations in Air, a Guidebook to Smell. So today we're going to talk about all things smell, how we smell, what is our sort of architecture, our apparatus for smelling, what do smells mean, what's actually going on when we experience smell, are smells subjective? Is there anything objective about smelling? It's such a fun and weirdly, deeply philosophical topic. So this is a really fun one, you guys. Without any further ado, here she is, Jude Stewart. Well, Jude, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Cara. It's a pleasure.
I am looking forward to talking about your new book, Revelations in Air, a guidebook to smell. This is like one of those fun things for Talk Nerdy where very often we get into super heavy science. And I'm also very interested in talking about science as it sort of relates to other disciplines, other experiences, kind of everyday life. And I think because of the work that you do, because of the writing that you do, focusing not necessarily on science, but on like design and on culture and even writing about food, this unique perspective is going to be really interesting, I think, for me and for the audience. And I'm just excited.
Well, that's exactly what I would want someone to say if they were sitting in your shoes. So I'm obviously in the right place.
So I have to know then, given that you have such a broad sort of beat, I guess we could say, as a journalist, what brought you to want to write a book about smells?
Oh, that is a great question. Well, I've written a lot about graphic design. So and so I'm sort of thought of myself as a visual forward person. And I think at some point my eye just got kind of tired, and I don't even know if I could have said that or put that into words until I sort of stumbled into this art exhibit. And it was all around smell. And basically what it was in miniature is a vacuum sealed room that you went into, and then one of the walls was just a huge kind of, it looked like an organ, almost like a big organ in a church. And it had the unusual ability of like both pumping out smells, but then fairly quickly removing them from the room. So you could have suddenly like the smell of Band-Aid, and then the smell of, pine, and then whatever other smell. And it was just like jolting and exhilarating, and like pressed all the buttons, and it was upsetting. It was everything. And I just thought, wow, this is the sense that's surrounding me all the time, and I don't know anything about it. And so when you actually look into the science of smell, that's weird because it's barely understood. And so, the rabbit hole like widened up, and my curiosity grew, and I just dived into it and came up with this book.
Oh, I love that. Gosh, I'm so envious. I would love to experience something like that. It's such a funny thing that, like you said, we experience smell all the time and we like really take it for granted. Of course, there's a whole swath of the population right now that is experiencing anosmia due to COVID infection, and they're very quickly realizing what it feels like to exist without their sense of smell, how much they probably did take it for granted, but to be confronted with it in a very almost intentional way must have been emotional to some extent.
Yeah, it really is. And it's funny because one of the first things you have to kind of grapple with is this thing that feels like a private phenomenon, but is actually, well known enough that it has a name. It's called the olfactory verbal gap. And it's like the way that you can recognize the smell, but you can't quite put a word to it. And so you sit in this space of being, viscerally like, I know that smell, but I can't name it. And so you can't access it the way you're used to parsing reality. And it's something just unusual. And it just sort of opens up a different way of being in the world. And eventually, if you sit with it for long enough, you'll realize, oh, it's the smell of sunscreen or the smell of, bacon or what have you. And then reality kind of reasserts itself. But it's fun to be, and a little discomforting to be in that space of familiarity and yet unfamiliarity.
Oh gosh, I love that. What a weird experience. And it also, a sort of whole other layer to it, which I know we'll get to as we dive into the science. It's just something that I'm more familiar with my background in neuroscience, is that smell is so deeply connected to memory. And so sometimes you get this evocative sort of reference point. You smell this thing, you have that verbal, like you said, that verbal gap. You can't quite put your finger on what it is, but you still start to feel things and you start to have familiar experiences that are all just beyond reach because you're tapping into a sense memory.
Yeah, yeah, I think it has to do with how smells are processed in the brain too, which I mean, this is going to be familiar to you, but maybe not to your listeners. The way that smells go up your nose, and then they ultimately they bind with proteins inside your receptors that are inside your olfactory bulb. And your olfactory bulb is basically this extension almost of your brain to the outside world. It's the closest your brain gets to the outside world. And from what I understand, and you can correct me because you know your neuroscience, but perhaps better than I do. But it's really tied up with your amygdala, which is responsible for your emotions, and the hippocampus, which has to do with memory. So it's kind of bypassing entirely that new brain that has all the verbal stuff and the higher order logic and things like that.
Yeah, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, I'm probably gonna have to Google this after the fact to know if I'm gonna leave it in the podcast or not, because I may be full on
That's good.
wrong. But most of our senses, vision, touch, taste, most of these senses are sort of processed in a way station in our brain. They actually have to pass through the thalamus before they can go to all of these higher order levels of processing. But smell is kind of the only one that doesn't. It just goes, like you said, straight to the olfactory bulb and then sort of straight to these cortical areas where emotion, where memory, where, other types of processing happen. And so it's like a faster processing as well. So it's really cool how much smell, sort of a sense that we don't think about very often, a sense that we definitely don't rely on as heavily as vision. We almost think of it as something that like rodents and our dogs are really into smell, but we're not very good at it and we don't really use it that much. It's got this kind of ancient evolutionary past in our brain that is still very striking. It's still very strong.
Yeah, well, let's Google that and make sure that we have all those facts right. But I think you're on it. I think you were correct. And another fact we can throw in there is that apparently our old brain was so tied up with smelling back in the day, millions of years ago, that it was called the rhinencephalon, the smelling brain. So
Yeah, I
it is
love that.
indeed a sort of very early sense, very early capability we have.
So let's talk a little bit about the sort of anatomy, the physiology, some of the things that you learned as you went on this deep research dive. What did you learn about how the nose works, how the nose connects to the brain, how smell molecules work, that A, you didn't know before, and B, maybe kind of surprised you or made you think differently about how we smell?
So the olfactory receptors were discovered in 1990, which is relatively recent. We have four different types, but we can smell way more than four different things. In fact, even that number is kind of trying to be figured out right now. There's a couple studies out there that put the theoretical upper limit at 1 trillion different smells for humans, which is a little crazy. So, to what you were saying earlier about dogs being really great smellers, and we don't think of ourselves as humans as being particularly good, we are extremely good at distinguishing between smells and really fine gradations. So, if you've ever smelled like maybe a really realistic, I don't know, cherry candy smell or something, you can tell the difference between that and like other types of cherry, maraschino or like Luxardo or the different types of cherry. And that's one of the many kind of exercises I kind of encourage in the book is just like cluing into that because you sort of instinctively know that. And that's why we recoil sometimes at fake smells. But we don't realize how finely graded we can get with our noses. So that was a real revelation right there.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. I sometimes wonder if the resolution that we try to put a number on or try to put a label on has more to do with our limits of categorization than it does with sort of the actual objective reality of this molecule versus that molecule. And I'm wondering sort of how fine grained do we get when we say, oh, I can smell this cherry versus that cherry. Is it a distinct molecule that I'm smelling? Or is it that, it's a slight variation on a theme? How do we decide the dividing line between this category and that category?
Well, that comes to another crazy fact that, just a sort of basic crazy fact is that you're smelling many molecules. So probably there are some common molecules among all those cherries. And perhaps if they're, dominant in the note of cherry, then, there might be a sort of signature molecule, if you will. Like cinnamon, for example, their cinnamaldehyde is a note that everybody sort of picks up on yes, the smell of cinnamon that is more unique to cinnamon than other smells, but doesn't necessarily it's not exclusive to cinnamon and it could be in other things. So you're smelling many molecules at once. The other crazy thing about the process of olfaction is we don't really know how olfactory receptors, how they bind to molecules. So there's this, obviously the molecules have to be light enough to float in the air and become airborne and go up your nose. But beyond that, we don't know why things smell the way they smell. I found it to be crazy to realize that you can invent smells. And in fact, not only is that not a crazy science fiction thing, but that's happening all the time. The perfumes, fragrance industry is working on that all the time. So these smells don't exist in nature. They're not synthesizing copies, although they are also synthesizing copies. But I'm talking about smells that did not exist on the planet until now, and we can smell them. So that's
And
also wild.
it's super wild, and it makes you wonder about sort of the subjective experience of, perceiving a smell that never existed, that sort of we never evolved, in tandem with. It makes you wonder, am I relating this new smell that was invented by a scientist in a laboratory, am I relating it to something that it reminds me of? Am I getting a sense experience because it's similar to X or it has notes of Y? Or is there a real experience of novelty with smell? Like, what a strange, and I guess that happens when people travel. It happens when people are exposed to new foods. It happens when, we go places where there are smells present that we just have never experienced before.
Yeah, and you're getting at another point, which is like, first you think, oh, we don't have language for smell and we don't have categories for smell, and one feels kind of at a loss because you can't put even like name the smell you're smelling, for example. So that was my initial experience. But then when I realized over time, it's like, okay, this is not as crazy and foreign as I thought. I have a pretty good a way to I have a good sense of like how to talk about foods and to create categories around food and the taste of food is really largely kind of driven by smell. Taste is in your tongue, but smell is mostly in your nose, and it kind of provides that higher resolution sense of this is not just salty, but it is a particular sort of taste. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is just that once you realize the categories exist and you can operate in them, then you realize that you can get better about thinking about smells just by talking them through and relating them to other things and putting them in the matrix of your own mind. Sommeliers and people who have really refined sense of smell do that all the time, and that is fundamental to how they educate themselves.
Okay, so tell me if you came across any information or what you learned about individual differences in smelling ability. And I ask this from a purely selfish, narcissistic perspective because from what I gather from all of my friends sort of weighing in and just being alive in the world and getting feedback from people, I have an insane sense of smell. Like I often smell things that other people can't smell or long before they do, or I'm very sensitive to like refrigerator smells and garbage can smells, and certain things are like very assaulting to me that other people are like, how can you even smell that? Or if somebody's cooking, I'm like, whoa, did you just drop an onion in there? And they're like, how the hell were you aware of that from across the house? And this has always been sort of my experience. And I'm wondering, A, why there's so much variability from person to person, and B, like what is responsible for that? Is it genetic? Is it, like you said, with sommeliers, they kind of train themselves? Like what's going on there?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. It's a combination of, natural ability, which it sounds like you have just in spades, and then the way we like educate ourselves or clue into that ability. So much like anybody can be musical, but then I can't necessarily sit down to a piano unless they've been trained. You can cultivate or not cultivate. I, on the other hand, I would say that I am like a solid B plus smeller, and I think I
Okay.
started maybe as a B minus smeller. So I want to emphasize that I am somebody who followed their curiosity and was not necessarily inherently good at this. you know, and training is important. So, but a lot of the questions you put through out there are ones that I think science is you're framing the next kind of generation of work for olfaction scientists because a lot of them are not answered. Many of us have anosmias for specific smells that you may never discover because I don't know you've never happened to come upon durian or whatever that highly specific thing is that you can't smell. Durian is a bad example though because durian is extremely smelly and almost everyone can smell it.
Oh,
It
durian's that
is
weird fruit that there are all those videos on like, online with cats smelling and then like gagging.
Yeah, yeah. Durian is a really stinky, stinky fruit from Southeast Asia that gets made a lot into ice cream. And I have a chapter on it in the book. And, I wanted to make friends with a smell that is initially very off putting and kind of become buddies with the stink. And I did. And I really made a lot of ice cream and really came to enjoy it. But all of us do have these specific things that we can't smell. Then if we happen to have never encountered that smell, we might not ever discover we have this lack. So that is a common thing. But yeah, you're describing a real mystery that has yet to be fully unraveled.
Yeah, very cool. Gosh, there's so many. Like, when you first sat down to write this, what were the big sort of pressing questions that you had? What were you like, I don't know this. I want to know this. And then, of course, maybe downstream you found the answer. Maybe you realized that even science doesn't know this. But what were some of those big curiosities?
Yeah, I mean, I was initially pulled in by the kind of emotional tug of the whole experience of smells, the way I felt that I couldn't speak about it, the way it made me feel kind of awkward to not know what to say and want to know something more. Like as a writer, I really wanted to fill that gap and think about that. Um, it is very hard to write about smell, so it's an interesting writerly challenge. Um, but I would say that probably the challenge that really hooked me was thinking, okay, well, how could I get to know an object or something and start with its smell? Like we don't usually sort of greet objects or people or anything by sniffing them, right? Unless
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
supposed to do that, that's kind of a weird move.
Yeah,
So
it's
I
like not
thought
really socially acceptable.
yeah, right. Well, so yeah, I'm the smell lady, like sniffing everybody, but I own it, But no, but seriously, I wanted to sit down and think. I thought about, there's this famous passage in Proust at the beginning of Marcel Proust's huge memoir about his childhood, and he smells this Madeleine cookie that has been dipped in lime tea, and supposedly from that moment, he's trying to grasp like what does it remind him of, and supposedly from that, like the entire book. unspools of his childhood, and it's thousands of pages of beautiful prose. So I had this idea that was more modest. It was just like, okay, if I started with the smell, like, and tried to find the story inside of it, whatever that story turned out to be, could I really just keep us inside the smell and find a place of illumination in a smell alone? So not just like, let's learn about pencils, but let's learn about pencils through the smell of pencils, the smell. And that seemed like a little crazy thought experiment, but I was able to do that, 50 times. Probably could do it more. And, I really enjoyed that as a process, getting to know things through their smell first.
Ah, it's cool. Yeah, there's almost like an anxiety involved in that, like, I don't know. I don't know why I'm thinking this, but maybe it's because it's like a childhood game, or there's something about if I close off the senses that I rely on most in the world. And of course, for most individuals who have access to all of the sort of evolved senses, there's sort of a hierarchy, right? Like, first we rely on vision. It actually takes up the most amount of brain architecture, and it informs our sort of experiences. And then we rely on, I don't know, is it sound next? I'm not sure, or touch, or whatever. And then, of course, there are many, many people, millions of people across the world who don't have access to certain senses. And so they have their own version of that hierarchy. But there's something almost frightening to me about not having access to certain senses and being confronted with something in a new way. I don't know why.
Well, and that's interesting you say that because it sounds like you're very good at smelling. So you're probably better qualified to do this, but than I did. But yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
I'm
And I
afraid the
wanted,
smells will be, like, offensive or something, like, I'll be
yeah.
surprised by them.
Well,
I don't
that's
know.
true, and, that was important. I realized that when I sat down, many things have smells, so when I sat down to think about what would be the chapters of the book, I had to make some decisions about the guardrails, and one of them was I'm not gonna make anybody sit inside a really awful, awful smell without some prior awareness of what they were getting into, Um, so there's gasoline, there's skunk, there's, durian, but, you know what you're getting into and you can skip that chapter if you don't like it. But smell really requires, trust because it does open you up and it kind of strips you of your verbal capabilities and sometimes plugs you back into memories and things. And so there's it makes you vulnerable. But I found the really moving part of writing the book after a while was that smelling is kind of like mindfulness turned inside out. Instead of sitting and just breathing and thinking about, my mantra or whatever, you're just sitting with the world. You're sitting in front of something and taking it in, and you can't really smell forever. Like your nose will exhaust pretty readily. And, so you have to just kind of be patient and just sit with it again. And I would sit for days at a time and, think about the smell effects and then try and capture it in words and, pull a story out of it. So, I had to just be calm and go back to it again and then see and bring a sense of curiosity. So I don't know, this was a marvelous kind of process of transformation for me that smell began and has kind of continued in my life.
Gosh, it sounds like it, and one of the things that I'm sort of connecting it to in my mind as you are describing it is not just the concept or the experience of mindfulness, which really takes from it a lot of, like, Eastern, but also some Western philosophy, philosophical tenets of sort of like the here and now, being very, very present, being in the extreme present moment and just noticing, what that moment offers. But also it takes me to a place, probably because I have this strong bias, because this is where my work has taken me lately, to a sort of existential humanistic approach to psychology, which is also very focused on the here and now. It's very much focused on the current phenomenology, like the current experience. And there's something, I don't know, like very fundamentally human about what you just mentioned, that smells exhaust pretty quick, like your nose gets exhausted pretty quickly and you almost have to like re-smell. It's very similar to an existential psychology concept of sort of like being in, how do I put this? All of these authors that came long before put it so beautifully, and I'm about to like mangle and butcher all of their work. But this idea that when you're in an existential mode of being, when you're really thinking about the intensities of like mortality and of freedom and responsibility and of loneliness and of meaning, you can't stay in that place for very long because it's threatening and it's exhausting and it's really confronting. And so you slip back into a mode of what they call normal being, of like consumption and entertainment, and sort of like slipping back into, you know, getting caught up in frivolous things. And then you can go back to a very existential, or what they call ontological, mode of being. But it's you just can't stay there that long. You exhaust yourself. And that's sort of like a metaphor for the human experience, that it's like this constant waffling back and forth because too much of one thing shuts down your senses.
Yeah, I think that, oh gosh, there's like, I'm so thumbs upping everything you said there. But yeah, it's true. Cause also smell is, on the one hand, we're presenting it as this, this complex thing, and it can be, and it can be fleeting, and it can be hard to grasp. But on the other hand, it can be comforting and everyday. And, you're cutting the lemon, just smell the lemon, just if you had a really frazzled day. I think on some level, when we have a frazzled day at work and we've been, like furiously emailing and like brain and jarring it like crazy, like you're not in your body when you're doing, your job. And at least from my experience, I'm just frenzily doing the thing. And at the end of the day, I want to cook. And it's on some level, it's because, you don't have to think about it, and because it's just with your hands. And I think it's just the senses also, and just making that space. So I now I'm aware when I'm cutting the lemon, like I'm smelling the lemon. The lemon is creating a sort of bower, and it's just this kind of caesura and chime that, blocks me out from whatever else I was doing. And so now I'm just kind of paying attention to that a little more. And that pumps up the sense of reality. This is like a feedback loop. If you're more
Yeah.
aware of it, you
Yeah.
become more aware of it.
And that really takes you to that sort of mindful, almost meditative space. I like to think about just walking. Like, I like to walk. I'm not very good at doing it every day, but when I find the time and the motivation and all of that, I like to just go on a walk. And I live in a relatively urban area. Where are you? You're in Chicago?
I'm in Chicago. Where are you?
Okay, yeah. So I'm in LA. So,
Okay.
similar. Like it's Chicago and LA, I think, have a similar vibe in that they're sort of like urban suburban. They're not like New York. It Unless you live in like the downtown portions or like very specific neighborhoods, it's not, just building upon skyrise, or high rise upon high rise. There are neighborhoods in LA, just like there are neighborhoods in Chicago. There are streets with houses on them. And so, depending on where you are, depending on where you live, you can have, for me at least, I have like a multitude of experience. I'm walking by a more industrial region. I'm walking by trees. I'm walking by, I can see the mountains in the distance. I smell cooking. I smell the taco truck. And then I smell this one tree that's very fragrant. And now I'm walking by jasmine on somebody's fence, that's growing, or bougainvillea. And it's really cool to sort of direct myself to the smells as I'm taking a long walk, and just drink in all of the things that the city has to offer, because the physical action of walking means that you're propelling forward through space. And so you're being exposed in any given moment to a completely different kind of suite of smells, which I just love.
You just said all my favorite LA smells too. I love the way when you walk past people's houses, all the different flowers, and the
Yeah,
citrus
yeah.
sometimes. And yeah, it's great. I love that. I'm a little envious because right now in Chicago, there's not much to smell. It's hard to smell when things aren't warm and kind of moist outside. Your nose is pretty absent from smells. So sometimes I get, a little whiff of like wood smoke, or, downtown there's Blummer's Chocolate Factory here in Chicago. And so you can get a whiff of that, and that's like fantastic. But,
Oh,
there's
yeah,
not a
because
ton to smell in the winter.
you might almost get like the striking experience of, you're right, everything's deadened in the cold. And like you said, because of the physiology of how the nose works, you need like moisture and you need warmth in order for the smells to kind of come to life. But because of that mutedness is almost heavily punctuated when you walk by a coffee shop or when you walk by chimney smoke. It's so strong against the background of almost nothingness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I get into that, and there's a chapter in my book about the smell of snow, which is a little bit of a cheat because technically snow does not have a smell, but it has this process that goes on in your nose. It's just more or less what you said, where you're registering the blankness, but then you might register after that a sudden rise in humidity, which kind of brings some smells in. And then there's this kind of tingling that happens in some nerves in your face called the trigeminal nerves. And those three things together kind of combined are pretty good, reliable indicator of snow coming. So
Cool.
anyway,
I
I
had
kind
no
of enjoy
idea.
feeling that. Yeah, well, come to Chicago and you can smell snow with me.
I know I've like really avoided like my snow experience. I'm still one of those very naive people who's like, what is this white stuff falling out of the sky? I shall retreat like every time I'm exposed to snow. So I probably just don't have a practiced experience in it because I grew up in Texas. I lived in New York for one fateful year and I got the hell out because it was like one of the coldest winters ever. And then came to LA and have not looked back since. Yeah, I'm trepidatious in the snow for sure.
You're in the good smell space. Stay where you are. But we have lilacs here in the spring. We have the lovely smells on the beach and a lot of good food
Yeah.
trucks in Chicago. We're doing all right in the smell department.
I love that. And so talk to me a little bit more about this experience of sort of cold and what cold does to the nose and does this kind of snow you just told us the pathway of like why snow quote has a smell but doesn't really have a smell. Is that at all similar to the smell of rain or is that a completely different like petrichor is really that we're smelling certain molecules being released off of the concrete and out of the grass?
Yeah, petrichor is another smell that it operates a little differently, but petrichor is the smell of parched earth after rain. So you need a little bit of a drought before you can register this. And what it is plants releasing chemicals into the soil. And so when the rain finally comes and aerates the soil, it releases this chemical. So what you're smelling is that aerated chemical. And some researchers in the 60s looked into this to try to figure out what is this magical chemical and what is it for. And they thought it might be fertilizer, which it turned out not to be. What it is the plants kind of it helps them compete with each other for the limited rainwater. So it's kind of the opposite of
Okay.
a fertilizer. It's sort of a weapon, but it has a beautiful smell, which we all recognize when it comes. It doesn't last for very long, and I found it so lovely that there was a word for this. I didn't know that this word petrichor exists. It comes from the Greek. It
Yeah.
means blood of stones, and
Whoa, really?
yeah,
What
yeah.
a cool, like, etymology, I love that.
Yeah, and and it also is. It's very common in perfume in a certain part of India. They make a perfume from it because if you think about India's cycles, they have the monsoons. It's a really long, extended dry spell, and then the rain comes, and so they're able to extract that from the soil there and make perfume from it. So there's
Wow, that's so
another name is
cool.
called Miti Attar. Yeah, it's really cool.
It's definitely a smell you experience living in California because we also struggle with drought, and then when the rains
Hmm.
come, they come, and you really can smell it because it's, if it rains here, it's probably not rained in months. And we've been having some rains recently, so I've really been able to smell that petrichor recently, and I love it. There's another it's just kind of coming to me. I know it's like a left turn, it's a random thought, but there's another source of smell that's got a lot of controversy around it, and I've kind of read about it a little here and there, but it's one of those other words that maybe some people haven't heard of. How do you pronounce it? Is it ambergris? Have you done a lot of deep
Ambergris.
dives into ambergris?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, ambergris is allowing me to say on the radio the phrase whale poop. um,
Yes.
so, what it is it's a perfume ingredient that comes from sperm whales. And I say whale poop, but let's like put that in air quotes because sperm whales are very hard to observe. So, we don't know that much about them. Scientists rarely are in direct contact. So, but what happens, as far as I understand, is they eat a lot of cuttlefish, and these cuttlefish have little, beaks and bones, and the bones pass through their digestive system and I guess make like a fecal impaction or that something happens and these it kind of gets gummed up in their system and it gets kind of pooped out into the water. And it truly is kind of poopy in its sort of natural state. But then these lumps will just cure in the ocean water and they just float around planet Earth potentially for years, and then they wash up on shore. And if they floated around and cured for long enough, they transform from a kind of really fecal, kind of a barny smell to something really beautiful, the sort of suggestion of flowers, and it's a really expensive perfume ingredient that is quite mysterious too.
Oh, it's so weird. Like I often think about, and I know that this doesn't relate, but in my mind it relates because I have a weird mind. But the other day I was eating an artichoke, and I prepped the artichoke and I cut all the little like points off of it, and I cut the top and I cut the stem and I put it in the steamer basket and I steamed it for like 45 freaking minutes, and then I like prepared my little butter with my elote seasoning, and I was dipping the leaves in it and eating them, and I was like, good God, the person who looked at an artichoke first and said, I'm gonna figure out how to eat that was
I
like
know.
a creative genius. And I think very often about these weird experiences of like, what perfumer back in the day thought, I'm going to go around collecting these like whale poop nuggets because they have this magical ingredient that smells so good to me, even though it's really strong. So I need to distill it down and use just a little bit of the molecule. Like, what a weird, people are very inventive. I guess
We're
that's all I have
inventive.
to say about that.
It's funny with so talking about ambergris makes me think of like how much armchair adventure this was to write this book during the pandemic where we
Mhm.
couldn't go anywhere and there wasn't anything to do.
Right.
Right. So I talked to several different ambergris dealers, through Facebook and various places, and essentially wheeled and dealed and got them to send me little tiny lumps of ambergris from across the world because I'm very persuasive. But this stuff is expensive, so I kind of needed to just talk a good game, and these people
Yeah.
were very generous and sent me these things, and it was what it ended up being was this accidental collection of four little lumps, one of which really did smell like a barnyard, but one of which was like just kind of shifting into that other that higher register that you're like, wow, okay, now I get it. And so I lined them up in a row and I had my whole family in our little pod. We had a pandemic pod. We all got together, including the kids, and we did this thing that I guess ambergris people do, but it's called the hot needle test, where you take
Okay.
a needle and you like light the end of it to be really hot, and then you stick it inside the ambergris, and then this little jet of like brilliant technicolor smell comes out for a brief period. It's much more vivid. So we did that with all the little lumps, and we could all sort of smell the difference and line them up in a row. And this was like part of our pandemic fun was feeling like we were scouring the beaches in New Zealand and finding ambergris.
I love that. I'm wondering if there was anybody in your pod who's listening right now who's like, yeah, fun. We had so much pandemic fun when you were writing this book. I bet you there are vastly different subjective experiences. Some people in your pod were like, this is so cool. And some were like, oh God, please don't make me smell anything else.
I mean, I think at the time that I was presenting some fun options, but like it's because there was nothing else.
Right,
But they
you're
were very
right.
generous. They were very generous, and I think they probably will listen. I'll tell you, we made truffles over pasta together, which was fun, and we did a couple little smell
Yeah.
experiments. I mowed their lawn so I could smell freshly cut grass. So they
Well, that's
benefited in
fun.
some ways.
Did you do the very simple experiment of like holding an apple versus a pear under somebody's nose and then taking a bite and trying to guess which fruit it was? It's so funny how when something is texturally almost the exact same, smell really does overpower almost everything else when it comes to quote taste.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, no, I did not do that one, but you are alluding to like the idea of simple exercises, which I definitely have in the book because I wanted to just bring it back to kind of simple things. That's a good one. I might have some bonus DVD material there to to be had. But yeah, another one in the book that I enjoyed a lot was just like if you have a lot of one type of cooking ingredient, like if you have a lot of different oils or if you have different vinegars, I think is a really good one. You can just pour them out into little jars. And at first, when you smell them, they all smell like vinegar. But then when you smell them again, you can really readily distinguish between them. And it makes you feel like a smell genius. Like you feel like you have confidence to take this idea on. So it's a confidence builder.
Oh, I love that. And do you mean kind of like the difference between an apple cider and a balsamic and a white wine?
Mhm.
Or do you mean like you have four different balsamics that are, different flavors or
Oh, I
different
think
manufacturers?
start at the beginning, like yeah,
Okay.
apple
Yeah.
cider to
Yeah.
balsamic or what have you. And I mean, I'm not fancy enough to have more than one balsamic, but yeah, but this is like a thing that, kind of mimics what other people do when they're training, their noses for really refined things like making perfumes or sommeliers. I was very nervous about talking to a sommelier and being that dumb person who was like, tastes like red wine. No, it's white wine.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
You're an
Yeah.
idiot. But that's exactly what they do is they start out at first, and they're like, okay, we're going to smell, or they will start with a broad class of wines, and then they eventually will move down to, Gruner Veltlingers from this region of Austria, but nobody starts there. They have to build their way up.
I'm curious. I mean, speaking about talking to a sommelier and talking to different people for the research of the book that have like a lot of exposure and experience to granular, sort of fine resolution smells, did you in your research determine if there are universals to smell? Obviously, a lot of smells are culture bound, a lot of experiences are culture bound, but is there anything kind of like the smile or the laugh? It's such a universal expression that every culture has it. Are there universally yummy smells and universally disgusting smells?
Ah, yes. Well, I would say that there's more agreement around the universal yummy smell. I mean, vanilla seems to be one that is very inoffensive and largely pleasant
Oh,
to most
okay.
people around the world, and there might be a couple of reasons for that. Vanilla is it like kind of supports a sort of a supporting actor that makes the starring flavor taste really good. It kind of rounds out flavors, and so you might have noticed in baked recipes, like sometimes you just put in vanilla even though you're making a chocolate cake. It's because vanilla does this thing of making everything a little more nuanced and beautiful. But it also doesn't trigger these nerves in your face that I referred to earlier. They're called the trigeminal nerves. And those are the nerves that get activated when you like cut up onions or you have like stinging hot peppers. And a lot of times, why we don't like a certain smell or taste is because it triggers that nerve in a way that we don't enjoy. So the absence of triggering it is kind of makes people like vanilla because it's not doing a thing they hate
Oh, interesting.
sometimes.
So it
Yeah.
may be that you really like it, or it may just be that it's not it, or that it's
It's
inoffensive to you.
inoffensive.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
But it is interesting to think about, like, at the other end, well, so what is the universally, like, hated smell? And that one is harder to get to, and the reason is because of habituation. If you are living in a part of the world where you're smelling a lot of garbage all the time, I mean, you may not love it, but you get used to it, and so it doesn't have the same shock factor. And so there's some stuff in the book about the I think it was the military's attempt to create like a universal stink bomb. And I believe Mary Roach, who's also been on your show, she's written about this too. And it's like harder to do than they all thought. And the reason is because of this habituation. So I gather that the way to make the universal stink bomb is to somehow create like a very weird combo where the two or four smells don't really resolve, that they are sort of still present as chocolate and gasoline and I don't know, arsenic or whatever it is, and that you smell all three of them at once. That's the sort of ticket, and it's pretty hard to do.
Oh, it sounds like it. I'm wondering if there is, though, a sort of because I'm trying to think of like our common biology and our common evolution and approach it less from a psychological perspective, which is sort of where my mind usually is, and more from kind of genetic perspective. And one thing that is universally offensive to us is death. We evolve to be afraid of death and to recoil from it. Obviously, my mind is on death a lot because it's an area of my current kind of dissertation research. But I'm curious about like whether these different factors like cadaverine and putrescine and these different factors that sort of take over as a body is decaying, most people have a very strong reaction to the smell of death. And I'm wondering if that occurs across the globe.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that might be the case. Yes, but it might be that you don't necessarily react to it until you know it's the smell of death. Again, thinking about these
Ah, yeah.
molecules, right? So you mentioned several molecules that are some of which are unique to cadavers, but some of which appear in other things. So for example, pecorino cheese and baby vomit smell pretty similar because they have the same dominant molecular note. But if you're told it's pecorino cheese, you're like, yummy. And if it's baby vomit, maybe not so much, right? So
That's
context
so
matters.
weird.
Yeah. So no doubt there's probably a molecule that of the ones that you mentioned that, really pings death and is unmistakably death. And yes, we probably don't like that. And it rolls up to the kind of the bigger reason why we smell in the first place. It's a form of defense system, right? Where it's a way our body has of observing threats or opportunities that have not yet reached us. So if I smell the smoke, I won't go towards the fire. If I the food smells off, I'm not going to eat it. So it's a we are kind of biased towards like picking out the smells that might want to kill us or
Right. Yeah.
indicate death. So yeah, I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, it's weird how much cheese, like if you ever go to one of those really fancy cheese bars and they describe the cheeses the same way that sommeliers describe wine, a lot of the descriptors that are listed are like, why would I eat that? It's like got a slightly vomitous taste. And you're
Yeah.
like, what? I don't want that.
Totally, totally, totally.
That's
Context is
speaking
everything.
of
That's the
You're so right. Yeah, context is everything. Speaking of vomit, I think for me personally, one of the foods that is revolting to me that a lot of my friends just don't get why I can't eat it is wings, like hot wings. They're so gross to me because they taste like puke. Like I just can't, or they smell like it.
yeah.
I don't know. That stomach acid, extra vinegary, like mixed with the spices. There's just something about it that like absolutely reminds me of vomit. And I don't know how people can be like, vomit. I'm going hard on this. But maybe that's
Yeah.
not what it tastes like to them. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think that you're onto something there. And it's interesting to think about how, when I think you think about flavor as a concept, I didn't realize this until I wrote the book. But as I alluded to before, taste is on your tongue, and there's pretty much five, possibly six tastes. Interestingly, there's another one in addition to umami that is being debated right now as a sixth taste, but there's basically six. And, so if you hold your nose and you taste a cup of coffee, it will taste bitter, but you won't necessarily know that it's coffee. Only when you open your nose and let those smell molecules come in can you say, oh, this is latte or it's espresso or whatever it is. And it's that finer grade thing. But on top of that, those two things, then we also have like mouthfeel and, temperature and other things, the crunchiness and so forth. And all of that together is what creates flavor. And so when I think about hot wings, it's like, yeah, it's that high acid smell, but also they're slimy. Like I just hate the way it's all over my fingers. I shouldn't say this. My husband's from Buffalo. I'm supposed to love wings, but
Right.
tell no one, Cara. Don't let anyone know. But yeah, it's that, and that gets to a larger thing of not just thinking about flavor, but thinking about how our senses are concatenating everything in the world all the time. So I was kind of bowled over to discover that there's like 22 senses and counting. Scientists are still figuring out the five that we think of as the big five is really only the beginning of how we like piece together the world. Thinking about things like proprioception, which is your sense of your body in space. It's like why you can walk down the cellar steps without the lights on because you feel your foot falling on the ground. You know where it is. There's many other different senses like that, and together they're creating reality for us.
When I think about the sort of the reality of each unique individual on the planet who has their own unique history, whether that's their cultural history, whether it's their familial history, or it's simply their history of kind of random experiences. And you've got the biological, you've got the like I just said, the experiential, sort of the historical, and all of these things come together to make us individuals, to make us unique. And something as simple as, let's say, perfumes, like consumer products that are produced to appeal to individuals, just like clothing. Like when we go shopping, we have a lot of options and we say, okay, I'm going to choose this because it's an expression of my whatever personality. When it comes to the perfumes that we choose to use or the colognes, I remember going to a couple perfumeries in Paris. Whenever I go to Paris, I always like to bring home things I can only get in Paris, right? And so there's a taxidermist I always visit called Des Roll. There's a couple perfume shops that I always visit because it's the only place that you can find these things. And I love it. And I remember getting like a crash course in, okay, you've got your what they call your spicy perfumes, and you've got your florals, and you've got your whatevers, and they, smell this, and what do you like? And so many of them are like highly offensive to me, and then so many of them are like really beautiful to me. And I'm thinking, who is the person who wants that? That reeks versus, this is amazing, but a completely different person could walk in and go, ooh, I hate the way that smells. To me, it's just such a bizarre thing that's that there are universals about smell, but it's so individual what we like and what we don't like.
First off, I love the visual of you like gadding from the taxidermist straight to the like perfume place. I hope you bring like a big dead cat with you and just like engage with a snooty salesperson. And okay, sidebar. That was my thought while you were talking.
I have to say, extra sidebar. I remember the first time I went to Dayroll and I came home with a taxidermied crow on a skull. It was very like Poe-esque, and we brought it. We had to bring it as a carry-on through like the airport. And I remember the agents in at Charles de Gaulle looking at us with this look on their face, and we can't speak French, and we're like, "Taxi del me," And the guy was like, "Yeah, okay, whatever, go ahead."
Oh my gosh, totally.
Ridiculous.
I have a similar experience with a metallic swine pig sculpture that I tried to take through Frankfurt, and it kept pigging on the metallic. Anyway, so sidebar. But yes, to your point, yeah, that it's so highly individualized, and it has to do with all of the experiences that we've ever had as a person, and we're still adding to that information today, which is exciting to me and like hopeful to think that you're walking through the world and there will be new smells and that you'll have new feelings about them and that they will roll up into the individual that is you, but also connect you with, communities and like make you new friends. This
Yeah.
is a lovely kind of thing. But yeah, what you were saying about talking about the different categories of smells, I realized I didn't touch on this earlier, but another crazy thing about smell is that there is no alphabet. We don't know yet what the kind of commonality, the way that we know, like there's the wavelengths of the color spectrum, for example, or you have the audio wavelengths for sound. We don't have a grip on that yet of like what are the basics, what are the real fundamentals, and I found that to be so fascinating. And there have been many people who've tried to create smell classifications on a scientific basis. I have a link that I'll send you that I ultimately used as sort of a loose organizing principle for my chapters, but even that is somewhat provisional. But it's relatively recent science. I wanted to have some basis for why I chose the categories I chose.
They're definitely constructs, and probably depending on your utilization, like depending on your God, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of your discipline, you're going to categorize things differently. So like a perfumer is going to have their categories, and that's going to be different than a food scientist, and that's going to be different than, somebody who is interested in like, can dogs smell cancer and what are the molecules that are present there? Like that probably really informs how people categorize smells.
Yeah, that a classification would have its use is that's an interesting thing to bring to that. Totally. Yeah, I really wanted to make sure there was room for stink in how I figured it out. Like I love me some stink, within limits, but yeah, I wanted there to be like a full range of like the experiences, of that one can have with smells. And the last point where you were saying when sometimes you smell a perfume and you're like, oh, who could go for that? It is interesting how some of the most beautiful smells can often have a kind of a ping of rotting or a ping of some kind of something disgusting in them, and it sort of heightens the beauty. It's like when you think of a beautiful woman who has a mole or a beauty mark and something that, kind of the flaw that shows how incredible she actually looks. There are smells like jasmine and lily that often are at their peak when they have that just kind of slightly sickly undertone of death, like that the flower is about to fall apart. So yeah, it's an interesting counterpoint to what we were talking about before with depth.
And so many perfumes that are so attractive, I think, to people have a musky, almost like a body odor undertone to them. Which, I mean, I guess it makes sense objectively, like kind of scientifically, when you think about the fact that like we are mammals. Mammals sniff each other's butts, like you look at how your dog greets another dog, and we don't do that as people because that would not be polite. But there must be almost something like sexual kind of like the core of the smell of another living breathing person, kind of these very biological smells aren't always good. but if there's a slight undertone of that mixed with these other things, that actually makes, especially with perfumes, them more complex. Like musk is a very common note, and musk is like BO. Like that's what that is.
Yeah, yeah, it's the smell of your body sort of amped up a little bit. Well, it's crazy the range and variety of smells that your body is giving off at any moment is telling all kinds of things about you and about your state of health, the kind of food you eat, which maybe ties back to your culture and your regular cuisine. Information about your immune system is coming off of your body as a smell, and we make mating choices to some degree with those things in mind too. So it is a little wild to picture, like, and think about the smell of my arm, which I can't even take in as a smell really, because it's like totally neutral to me. Nonetheless, it's just rich with information that someone else can perceive.
Oh yeah, I always think about like people's homes, like their little hovels, and like how when you walk into somebody's home, there are these unique smells that are them, and you can also kind of smell what somebody prioritizes. Like I'm a very ascetic kind of like my house has nothing on the surfaces. There are rooms with a lot of books, and sometimes there's that book smell. But I also like candles and I like incense, and I like to induce a smell in my home. But some people's houses just have their sort of smell. Like I don't know why I go back to this image, and maybe you remember what movie or TV show this is from. Maybe it was from uh oh god, what was the movie with now Page. His name is now, oh god. He used to be Ellen Page. That's his dead name, and now he's Ethan
Oh,
Page
yes, yes,
or
yes, yes.
whatever.
Okay, so which movie was it? Juno or
Juno. Yeah, in
yes?
Juno, I
Okay.
think it's in Juno, there's a scene where Michael Cera, God, I eventually got there, is like talking about a girl he wants to date, or maybe it's a different movie, but and he's like, her house smells like soup. And I don't know why that really resonates for me, that like some people have very soupy smelling house.
It's true. Yeah,
Like
it's
it's
extraordinary. What is
weird.
it about, like, childhood smells of your friend's house? I mean, I can walk into someone's house and be like, unable to continue because they smell just like, my friend's house down the street when I was 5 or whatever it is. And you're just trying to figure out. And you're right. It's sort of a concatenation of all these things they do in their house. It's not
Yeah.
just that they have, I don't know, wood beam ceilings, which I'm sure is part of it, but that they clean at a certain rate and they cook so often and they open the windows or they don't open the windows. They have mold starting or they don't have mold starting.
Or they have
It's just their
pets,
whole life.
or yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, they have a dog, exactly, or something, but yeah, that it can be a real showstopper.
Oh, serious. It's, like, intense sometimes you go to people's houses and you're like, "Wow, you do not notice that it smells like this, do you? You can't smell it, can you?"
May I
Um,
ask you a question? Is it fun for you to be a super smeller, or is that sort
no,
of,
it's horrible.
bombarding? Oh, yeah.
It's yeah, it's horrible. I very often wish I couldn't smell the things that I smell because, I think when we smell pleasant things, great, but we're often confronted with things that are less pleasant, and even pleasant things aren't always pleasant to me. Like I might buy a new candle that in the store smells really good, and then when I light it, it's so overwhelming and strong that I have to put it out because it's too, like, even the good smell is too intense. That's definitely happened to me a handful of times, but more often than not, it's weird things like refrigerator smells. I have to be really neurotic about leftovers and about sealing things in the refrigerator because it will turn my appetite for a food if it has
Oh,
too
like
strong a
forever.
smell before.
Yeah,
Yeah, like, if something has
yeah.
too strong a smell before it's cooked, and then I cook it, it's sometimes not transformed enough, like, the memory is too present, and it actually it makes me lose my appetite for it, and that's a huge bummer.
Yeah, yeah. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I feel for you. I know that sometimes when women become pregnant, when I was pregnant, I wanted to be a super smeller because I'm not in normal life. And I did have this incredible moment of going into a restaurant. I was really hungry because, pregnant, very hungry. And someone's steak came out from the kitchen and I thought maybe it was my steak. And it was like, I smelled it from across the room and it was like, like this just highly punched up kind of as if, like cartoon smell lines were reaching me from the steak. But that was my only instance of feeling like I was a super smeller and it was
Really?
awesome, but it was brief.
How much do you think that the experience of so I've never been pregnant and I don't plan to be pregnant, but a lot of my friends have kids, and I'm curious how much of that sort of first trimester nausea, morning sickness experience, how much I wonder how much smell contributes to that. I have a friend right now who's pregnant who told me the other day, she's like, I almost threw up at Whole Foods. It was rough. Like
Yeah.
I had to get out of there. And I wonder how much of it is because little things trigger that, that weakness in their guts.
Yeah, and I've often told I remember when I felt that way, you're supposed to eat a little something, it settles your stomach, and it works, but, like, imagine feeling nauseated, and then you're like, "I'd love to chow down on some graham crackers," like, it's not
Right.
not what you think you should be doing.
Right.
But,
Right.
yeah, yeah, it could be a thing, that's for sure.
Oh gosh, yeah, that sounds insurmountable to me. There are many reasons I don't want to be pregnant, but now that I'm thinking about what it would be like with my super smelling ability, although hell, maybe I would become a non-smeller. Maybe I would just be like, "Whoa, everything is dead to me. This is amazing." you know. I think the grass is often greener for sure. So I got to know from you personally, what are your smells? If you're out and you're buying a scented candle, if you are, on a walk, if you're purchasing a perfume for yourself or a lotion, do you go for the things that are more like floral? Do you go for the things that are like baked goods? Like, what do you want your house to
Oh,
smell like? What do
yeah.
you want to smell like?
Well, I think I wanna smell like a sexy pencil I've discovered.
Okay, I love it.
I was not a perfume person before this, and, and I felt a little like I'm not a super girly girl, and so I thought, "Okay, I have some skin issues and things," so I was sort of always, like, a little bit standoffish with perfume, but you can't really write a book about smell and not get into it with that question, and, when I started sitting down with my friends who did wear perfume, I was really surprised at the things that interested me as smells, like, I wanted this just, like, weird, I wanted to, like, smell like trouble, So this, like, smoky and, like, resinous and, kind of unplaceable and just really weird smells. So the perfume I'm enjoying a lot right now that's probably my go-to is called Molecule 5, and it's by, Eccentrics Molecules, and it's a totally invented molecule from the lab. It's called Cashmeran is the name, and it's sort of you feel like you're sort of smelling a lily, and you're smelling a fire, and you're smelling some unplaceable something else. And, it is none of those things. It is none of those things. There's none of that in it. So I love the kind of unplaceability of that. I also really enjoyed smelling pipe tobacco. And, I sat with these smells for days and, you would get tired of all of them eventually. But pipe tobacco, I never got tired of. And just maybe because of the connotations of, like, it's sweet without being cloying. There's a lot more variation in it than you realize. It connotes like libraries and, I don't know, men
Leather.
reading big leather-bound books and
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, and it was introduced to me by a good friend, and, he was a pipe smoker, and we used to hang out on the pandemic kind of hang on the terrace where we were 6 feet apart, and he would just sort of slide the new tobacco across, and we'd smell it. And, so I think it, reminded me of those times together, and so I could always smell some pipe tobacco.
I love that. Yeah, I got weirdly into crafting during the pandemic and because lots of free time and needed to do something somewhat productive and I don't know, experiential and I've tried my hand at a million different crafts, but I really do like making like I make candles, I make soap, I make bath bombs, like make and a big part of that is like what are the essential oils and what are the smells and how am I going to mix them together and make them work. And I definitely find that one of my biggest crowd pleasers is the sort of tobacco, leather, sandalwood, black pepper, like those kinds of mixes. This deep smoky, but with a touch of sweetness and maybe a touch of spice that people really tend to like that. I myself love things that smell like I could eat them, like baked goods. I
Oh,
love
yeah?
things that smell like cinnamon and vanilla and sugar. Yeah, it's weird. And some of my perfumes go along that kind of line, but I think probably my most interesting perfume that I have is one that I did buy in Paris, and it was called I'm trying to remember, something like Piment Brûlant, and it's pepper. It smells like you've freshly chopped bell peppers.
Oh,
It's the
wow, that's really
yummiest. Yeah, it's like the weirdest, like, you don't usually see that in a perfume, but whenever I wear it, people are like, "Oh my god, that smells so fresh and so good." And every time I kind of, I save it for special occasions and stuff, but every time I spray it, I'm like, "Oh, I love this." And it's such a weird, unique vibe for a perfume.
I think I'm not, my book is not necessarily all about the molecules, but there's this molecule pyrazines is a category of molecules, and it's really associated with bell peppers. And so maybe that's what you're smelling is some pyrazines. They often they come up in wine too. When wine is kind of in the process of maturation, sometimes at the middle state, it'll give off that pyrazine smell, and so sommeliers like kind of smell for the bell pepper to see if was this a late harvest or not quite the late harvest, which is interesting. But yeah, it's interesting to think about smells like on your body versus smells that you want to like hang out in, like in a bath bomb. That sort of ends up being a smell of your body, but it's sort of a space you can hang out in. I think I would apply a different logic to like, yeah, the smell I want to hang out inside. Like I don't want to smell like pipe tobacco, but it does have that quality of literally they refer to the tin note, which is what it smells like before you've smoked it, and then the room note, which is the smell it leaves in the room. And I do love hanging out in that space, even if I personally don't want to smell like it. And
Right.
I, I love smelling baked goods. Like I'm all about that if I can eat them. you know,
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely have had people tell me that before. They're like, "Oh, it smells like cake, but there's no cake." It's so sad, you know? Like, why would you do that to yourself? And I'm like, "I don't know. I don't know. I want my house
and
to
you're
smell
like, it
like
could be
cake
like a
even if
trick.
there's no
Here's the
Yeah.
smell and here's the cake, and then you just one to them.
I often wonder if I would be, in another life if I could have trained as a sommelier and if I would have been good at it. But the funny thing, here's the rub. I hate alcohol. I think it's disgusting,
It's
which
true.
sort of is unsurprising. And I think the truth is a good sommelier is not like getting drunk every time they go to work. They're tasting things and spitting them back out, which to me is a little bit more appealing than actually swallowing the different alcohols. But yeah, I don't think I would ever enjoy my job because I don't like alcohol and I don't like alcohol culture and I don't like the way alcohol tastes. But I wonder if I would be good at it.
Yeah, well, and then that's the thing that it's interesting to think about. I don't know why sommeliers got the lock on this, but for whatever reason, we are ready to think about wine in this very wordy and thoughtful way. And there's some other things we're willing to think about, like cheese, as you mentioned, or perfume. I wrote a chapter about cannabis, and we're not sort of prepared to take that kind of fancy appellation, to that. We don't want to talk that way necessarily about cannabis, but you can absolutely talk about that.
Oh,
Talk about
I
cannabis,
think
and
some
it
shops
smells that
here in
way.
LA definitely do.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
They
and what
definitely have
feels a little
the
weird,
yeah.
talking in that way, but it really gets you closer to what you're appreciating and what you're going for, and recognize the differences and things. And so, part of me was like, let's just stop worrying about being snobs and just um, like apply that kind of thoughtfulness and that way of verbalizing and getting closer to things, to anything. It doesn't have to be expensive wine. Like I made a point of not writing about expensive wine. I think my bottle that I examined really closely was like a $20 thing. So, because I didn't want to go there. Also, I could not afford to go there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's true. You see movements even like there's like olive oil movements and, I've had friends who wanna go to Napa and I'm like, "I wouldn't have any fun." And they're like, "You could do like an olive oil tasting." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, they do that now." That's, sort of for the non-drinkers. And there are little kind of pockets of movements towards having that more, I guess, mindfulness, really. That's what that is. That's what is taught in sort of mindful eating courses and mindful eating meditations is sitting there and really noticing the smells, the tastes, the textures, really experiencing your food and not just eating mindlessly and sort of being like, oh God, I don't, it's like a blur. Like driving home last night, I don't remember it happening. Oh, what did I eat?
Yeah.
Know?
Yeah, I
um,
mean, maybe it's just a lot of junk food is kinda amped up for you to eat it and notice it even when you're not noticing, that it's, like, really super salty or, all the flavors are really dialed up to 11 because we're sort of chomping on it as we drive down the 405 or whatever. And the opposite of that is, food that you have to kind of think about, or an experience you have to, get a little more closer to and fine tune to. And I guess like I would like there to be more space for that. And smell is a thing that opened up, that possibility for me. And another thing I love about smell is it's just sort of resistant to capitalism. Like it's everywhere, and you can, it's as free as the air. You can smell anything, and just
Right.
pay attention to it, and that's nice.
You wrote in your book, sorry to keep you because I know we need to wrap up soon, but you did write in your book about attempts to sort of, trademark smells, right? Like how, capitalists gonna be capitalists, right? And they're gonna try to
hmm
apply these principles of, like, money making even to something as freely available as a scent molecule, and how did that go for them?
Well, it is possible to trademark a smell.
Yeah.
There are not many. So I wanted to write about Play-Doh because I wanted to do a smell that was, evocative of childhood and the whole thing. And then the really surprising thing to discover straight away is that that smell is trademarked. And like, all right. And then so it begs the question of like, well, what's the difference between a patent and a trademark? And a patent has to do with the product's functionality, like whether or not it does the thing you bought it to do. And so trademarks have to do with non-functionality. They have to do with all those intangibles of knowing that you got the real thing. So it's the real Play-Doh. So, I thought that was a sort of interesting distinction. And also, of course, then I ran down the rabbit hole and was like trying to find all the trademark smells, of which there are like surpassingly few. Look, Play-Doh is by far the biggest. I mean, a couple yeah, a couple smell signatures from like I think there's Verizon, it might be, or it's a one of the mobile stores has a signature smell, and it's like flagship stores. But other than that, it was like ukuleles that smell like pineapple, or it was like highly specific flip flops that had a particular smell, which strangely my book editor had owned those, and she's like, "Oh, I love those smelly flip flops." I'm like, "They're trademarked." But yeah, so
Are
it's
they is it that weird
yeah.
plasticky smell that we love? Like, those plastic wallets or, like, packaging that weird I don't know how to describe it. It's very
Yeah.
petroleum based, but we love
Yeah,
that
well, that's more
smell.
like off-gassing, just straight up
Yeah.
plastic being plastic. But
Right,
but
right.
yeah, no, I guess there was, I never encountered these, but these flip-flops that she owned, they smelled like coconut or something, and it would somehow waft up from your feet, and you would like get a little whiff of it as you were walking down, Park Avenue or whatever. Um, so it was like, so you knew you had the true XYZ brand flip flop. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting to think about that the smell is this combination of what Play-Doh really is, which is, it's a dough you can make at home, but then it's got a few extra just additives that give it that signature. This is the real Play-Doh, which, probably any fragrance chemist with any skills could create an actual, Play-Doh smell at home. And as long as they didn't smell it or sell it, they could enjoy it. But yeah, it's funny to think that that's like that reality is engineered in that way. But quite a few smells are created and consistently put forth in a very specific formula.
Yeah, I think about, like, natural gas, how people say, it doesn't actually have a smell, they add a smell to it so you can smell it if it's
Yeah,
leaking in your house, like, that's not actually what natural gas smells like, and like, "Oh,
right.
weird."
And all your lotions and stuff, like sometimes they might have a bad natural smell, and then they remove that natural smell and add a nice smell. And even unscented products are often like they're sort of edited versions of reality. They've taken out some unpleasant naturally occurring smell and just sort of rendered it very neutral.
So weird, like they've scented it to be unscented, I love
Yeah,
that.
kind of. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, with that idea of, like, emptiness of smell I was actually talking with a friend about this recently, and we have this conversation a lot. It was such a weird thing where, he often talks about something smelling empty, and I don't know what he means by it, and the only thing I can imagine when he starts to describe it is that he's talking about ozone, the smell of ozone, which does have a very particular smell, which I could see one might describe as being an empty smell. But it's such a strange like you talked about earlier, like, we don't have language for a lot of these things.
Yeah, you guys should sit down and try to work that out, because that is, I mean, maybe no smells are empty for you because you have the super smeller status, and perhaps for him it's not. It's funny, there was this trend in perfumes not too long ago of sort of barely there smells, and so the idea was that it was just it was like you were supposed to smell like yourself, but with a slightly edited, kind of, I don't know, rounding up on your sexiness factor. It was like very, very slight, almost not there perfumes. And another one that I tried was one of these invented molecules that I wrote about in the book called ISOE Super, and it is that kind of smell. Like you put it on and you're just sort of maddened by. It's not. It almost just smells like you, but not quite. It's a little more like it's unplaceable in this way that is fascinating. It makes you notice the emptiness of it. So I don't know. Get some ICA Super and see what he says.
Yeah, seriously, see if that's like, "That's it, that's the smell."
The smell.
Yeah, it comes up a lot. This is gonna be the weirdest thing. I don't know if I wanna even include this in the show, but whatever. We'll see how it goes. There are certain trees God, I can't
Mm.
believe I'm gonna say this. There's certain trees when you're taking a walk that
Oh, I know what
smell
you're going to
like
say, Cara.
semen. Yeah, like the
Yeah.
semen trees, and that's where it comes from. It's like the semen smell to this person smells quite empty. And I'm like, "No, it doesn't."
Oh my God, that's it smells like the opposite of empty to me. But
I
maybe,
agree.
okay, now we really can't put this in, but maybe he feels emptied when he smells it, which is like good for him. I mean, I guess I might want to hang out in that smell all day long if that's what it meant.
Oh, it's so weird. It's so
Oh
weird.
my
But yeah, why
gosh.
does semen have such a very particular smell, and why do some trees smell like semen? These are the great mysteries of the world.
To be continued, the next episode.
Seriously. So, Jude, I have to ask you before I close all my episodes by asking my guests the same two questions. So I have to steal you for at least a
Okay,
couple more
let's do it.
minutes.
Let's do it. That's
But
fine.
is there anything we didn't discuss? Anything that's in the book that you're like, oh God, why didn't we even talk about that? Or like, I don't know, something that we didn't go there that you'd be remiss that we didn't?
No, I think this was marvelous. I really enjoyed. I love that you could get really detailed, and I did feel like I talked nerdy, so that's good. No,
Hell yeah.
I feel very satisfied in that score. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad. Okay, so here we go. And this is going to be great because this is like a weird left turn from everything we've been talking about so far. Always super curious about all of the really thoughtful and brilliant people that I'm lucky enough to sit down with on the show. Two big picture questions, like really big picture. So I want you to answer them contextually in whatever's meaningful to you right now. So this could be very personal. It could be more global. It could be cosmic. Whatever context makes sense to you. The first question, the bummer question, we'll get it over with first, is when you think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night? Where are you legitimately concerned, pessimistic, maybe you're cynical, worried, what's gnawing away at you? And then on the flip side of that, so we can end on a lighter note, where are you finding your optimism these days? What are you looking forward to in a genuine, authentic, not a lip service way, but like truly you're hopeful for?
Okay, so definitely with the bummer, it's climate change. Um, and I feel I'm not original in saying that on a science show, but
Not at all, but that's
not at
okay
all.
because I think it's an important point that like literally everybody talks about climate change.
Climate
It's
change. Yeah, well,
meaningful.
and I mean, in connection to this book, I guess one of the smells I was unable to encounter in person was the smell of melting permafrost. And I believe there's actually an article in the New Yorker this week about the smell of that smell. And the whole point of melting permafrost is it should be frozen and it should have no smell. And when you're smelling it at all, it's because it's leaking gases. So much carbon is tied up in the permafrost, and there are diseases that we have gotten rid of that are ready to come back out from the Middle Ages and roar their way from Siberia into the world. So, the smell of permafrost melting was something that um, you know, I watched a couple of videos of people who were Arctic scientists, and they were all describing it, and so I was able to sort of triangulate like this is what it must smell like. But I think I would find it almost unbearable to smell it in real life, knowing what I know about it. Yeah. So, but what makes me optimistic? Okay, I would say I have been very lucky in the pandemic to not be you know, no one I love has died from it, knock on wood. And I've been mostly unscathed by the experience, even though I know I'll be changed by it. And I think that, you know, there, there's so much negative that I could say about it. But what I would say that's positive is that I think it was very character forming. I didn't plan on writing a book about smell during this extraordinary time, and and then to find out that the pandemic was marked by a loss of smell was even a weirder bonus. But it made simple pleasures so much more satisfying and so much closer at hand. I have this ability to have like literally just very small things will blow my skirt up, because because of like how kind of it clamped down on our senses and clamped down on all the things we think we wanted to do that constituted fun. And yeah, I miss going and doing all those things too, but I'm starting to do those things again cautiously. But at the same time, I'm trying to hold on to just like being satisfied with small pleasures and the here and now. And I don't want to ever let go of that. And I'm trying to narrate that in my life. And I think it's just created a richness about every day. It just makes me more aware of the everyday nature of living too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Gosh, well, Jude, this has been such a, I don't know, such a fun exchange, but also a really informative one, a challenging one. And hopefully, for everyone listening, they've been really reflecting and thinking in a deeper way, in a more mindful way about this sense that I do think we very often take for granted. So thank you for enlightening us and also for doing all of the legwork to put out this beautiful book. It's Revelations in Air, a guidebook to smell. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing it with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was such a fun conversation.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.